Story 1. A friend's sister who lives outside Jackson Hole told me how hard it is to live there. You have to fly and help for cleaning and yard work from Salt Lake. I had no words. Story 2. Back when I was in my early 20s, my old beat-up car broke down in the work parking lot as I was about to drive home. I earned $10 an hour as a pastry chef at a catering company, which was barely enough to cover my rent. I was distraught when the car died. My boss, the company owner, told me not to be upset, that it was just a car and that I should buy another one. I could not respond. I simply looked at her as if she were crazy. Story 3. I occasionally drive minibuses for a private school in the United Kingdom and have overheard some very privileged conversations among the students. One that stands out is when a tutor asked a student what he says when other students comment on the very expensive watches he wears to school. He replied, "My dad has the same 24 hours as your dad." He then said his father inherited a massive entertainment chain and several hugely successful companies from his grandfather. Story 4. If you can't afford childcare, just hire a nanny. We love ours. Story 5. My Starbucks coworker in Calabasas, known as Kardashian Land, said it is so easy to spend nearly $1,000 at Target after he spent $983 on toys for the birthday of his 4-year-old nephew. I do not know why he worked at Starbucks. Maybe his rich family finally forced him to get a job. Story 6. I was an assistant making just over $50,000 a year, and I heard someone on the board of directors say, "Of course he, the mayor of a city, stole the money. You cannot live on $90,000 a year." Story 7. A man who has never worked and lives off inherited money told me that people in poverty are in that situation because they do not invest their money properly. Story 8. Before the pandemic, a member of Congress thought our average salary was $100,000 per year. Story 9. A rich person once said to me, "Why don't you just buy a second house as a vacation home?" As if owning one house wasn't already a huge financial stretch. Story 10. How could your family accountant let that happen? When I talk about growing up, we could not pay the bills and our water and electricity were shut off multiple times. Story 11. When people tell me I should just take off and go somewhere for a week, even if I made the money, I would be sacrificing the time itself because I do not get any paid time off. Story 12. I did not understand why we did not receive more than one gift on our birthdays and at Christmas. It was usually clothing. Story 13. A coworker asked me what bank I used for my safe deposit box. I said I did not have one. She said, "But where do you keep your jewels, then?" Edit. I said I did not have any jewels, and she just said, "Huh," and changed the subject. I understand the sentiment. If I owned anything expensive, I would probably also have a safe place for it. Something about the question made her sound like a Disney villain, even though she was a very nice person. It is a very vivid random memory. Thanks, original poster. Story 14. Why did you take your car to get looked at? Just get a different one. I don't know why you waste your time with mechanics like that. Story 15. A company event where people with investment properties told us you just need to save hard to get that deposit. They suggested skipping dinners out with your spouse and only going to the pub every other Friday. So cut restaurant meals and pub visits and you will still be broke. My colleague left the Zoom midway through. If it had been in person, he would have broken the door on his way out or crossed the conference table toward them. Story 16. My boss at the time made 5 to 10 times more than I did. We were talking about big purchases like a car or a house, and he said I would get a great deal because I would be an all-cash purchaser. I just smiled and nodded, knowing that, given my salary, which he knew, I could not even pay for groceries in cash. Story 17. Years ago, while working for a valet parking service in the Santa Barbara area, we were hired by a woman for a jewelry showing at her large house in Montecito. While waiting for guests to arrive, my boss told me that when guests left, I had to be sure to close their car doors, because they were so used to people closing them that they might drive off with them open. Story 18. I needed a bicycle to get to a new job. I found someone online selling a nice bike for a low price, so I got in touch. I took 2 trains to their house to buy the bike, and when I arrived, it was a mansion. The bike was in a garage full of supercars and classic cars. They asked where my truck was so they could load the bike onto it. When I told them I was riding it home, they laughed. Before I knew it, everyone in the house had been called to the garage to hear about how I was riding the bike 3 hours home in the dark. No one offered me a lift. They just seemed pleased they did not have to do such things. Story 19. Many variations of the question, why don't the homeless just rent an apartment or buy a house? Story 20. My old boss criticized her new son-in-law and said, he won't be any kind of decent husband. He only makes that amount an hour at his lousy job. My boss clearly forgot that I was making less than that. Story 21. I was the live-in superintendent of a building in Boston. The building had 43 units. 40 were occupied by college students. One year a young woman moved in next to me, and 3 months later her electricity was shut off. She started pounding on my door, demanding that I turn her electricity back on. I checked her circuit breakers. They were fine. I went into her apartment and immediately noticed a pile of electric company mail on her table with big red letters reading "Last Warning." I said, "You didn't tell the electric company that you were the new tenant." She replied, "What's the difference? Why do they need to know it's me?" I said, "They need to send you a bill for electricity usage." She said, "Now I know you're messing with me. You don't pay for electricity." She moved out 2 days later in embarrassment. Her parents had to pay to break the lease. She couldn't look at me for those 2 days. Story 22. I am a type 1 diabetic, and medical costs are prohibitive without insurance. This happened in 2012 when the Affordable Care Act was going through Congress. My boss was against it, and I told him how getting insurance would help me. He grimaced and said, "That is your responsibility. You should get a job." I worked for him, and he made sure not to provide benefits to employees. Story 23. Rishi Sunak, British Prime Minister for the moment, is stinking rich and grew up in a pretty affluent family. He went to a leading private school, Winchester and Oxford University. During the current election campaign, while doing interview rounds, he was asked whether his family had ever had to give anything up. After hesitating, the only example he could give was Sky, a British satellite television service. He was lampooned for days over that. He really is a colossal twat. Story 24. I love Dairy Girls, and I asked my husband to watch it with me again because I found it really funny. After watching the first episode with him, he said, "It is funny, but I can't relate to their problems with money and food." Story 25. I used to travel for a glamping company, short for glamour camping, setting up large canvas tents for upscale weddings and parties. One morning we woke very early to a flurry of calls from a wealthy Los Angeles socialite who complained that the tents were wet. We rushed over and discovered she did not understand morning condensation. I explained that I could not control nature and that she would not be getting her deposit back. Story 26. Well, my girlfriend, who is from a wealthy background, just implied that having a barbecue is hick. Story 27. I work for a startup based in San Francisco. I am a remote employee halfway across the country and therefore a second-class citizen. My direct peers who work in San Francisco make at least double what I do, and they almost all had extremely privileged upbringings. They attended top 10 business schools and spend summers in Lake Tahoe. A few months ago, I was in the home office for our annual kickoff meeting. One of the speakers polled the room and asked if anyone had worked at Amazon. No one raised a hand, and the speaker said they were surprised. I replied, "Does warehouse count?" The entire room erupted in laughter. I thought I had told a very funny joke. Story 28. I want to say he was 12 or 13 years old. The son of one of my clients looked genuinely confused when I asked him where I could get more paper towels after they ran out in the washroom of his parents' multimillion-dollar yacht. He said, "It's always there. What do you mean?" He was so disconnected from cleaning and restocking that he assumed supplies would never run out. I couldn't help but laugh at the genuine confusion on his face. That's not the first time I've experienced that. Talking to the children of extremely wealthy people is always a trip. Story 29. When we were with our friends, a wealthy friend showed us his new expensive winter jacket that cost more than €500. From time to time, he goes on shopping trips with his father and spends 1 to 2,000 euros. Once we confronted him about his bragging and asked if he did not think his spending on clothes was excessive. He answered, "Well, I know some people who spend more and some who spend less, so I think I am average." Statistics 101. Story 30. How do you only have one dishwasher? Imagine their shock when I told them the apartment I had just moved out of, where I had lived for 14 years, did not have one at all. Story 31. A woman became genuinely angry when people suggested she could take public transportation to the airport instead of paying $50 for an Uber. She posted on social media about it. Update. The bus they suggested is very convenient and goes directly from our college to the airport, so it is not like she would have to drag her luggage between buses. Story 32. A man recently gave all his money away and lived on the streets to show that anyone could earn millions. Then his father died and left him an inheritance worth millions. He stopped living on the streets and said he had proved his point. Story 33. I wouldn't consider this out of touch, but I was definitely amazed. Several years ago, I worked at a retail store that sold a lot of different items. I was at the cash register on a Friday afternoon when 3 young women in their early 20s walked in dressed in luxury brands. They bought a suitcase and several other random items that totaled almost $400. When I announced the total, one of them pulled out 4 Benjamins as if she were pulling out cash and handed them to me without looking. I asked if they were going on a trip. One of them answered, "No, we got sick of carrying our stuff." I understand getting tired of carrying things too, but to buy a whole suitcase and more just because they were tired was surprising to see. Story 34. I have known quite a few people who did not realize the benefit they received from having a house, a car, and the cost of a degree, sometimes including advanced degrees, provided by their parents. It is much easier to budget when those items are removed from the equation, and even more so when you can earn some income from the house. Story 35. During a dinner party, we started talking about our experiences in high school. I mentioned the diversity of my large 6A high school and that almost half the student population received free or reduced price lunch. A woman who had grown up privileged in the San Francisco area burst out laughing, thinking I was joking. She said, "Free or reduced price lunch? Why? What, they couldn't afford food?" The room fell silent and became awkward when I explained that, yes, that's exactly what happens in public schools. She had only attended private school from kindergarten through graduate school. Story 36. I was talking to a very wealthy woman we had just videotaped. She was a board member at one of the largest oil companies on the planet. She told me she used to summer in Prague. I told her I used to summer at school. I thought that was a damned funny line, but it didn't register with her. She was confused about how it related to what she had said. Story 37. Once a college-age coworker tried to explain to a group of us in emergency medical services that his family wasn't that rich because they only had a beach house, not a summer house, and he explained the difference between the two. Another coworker pulled up his apartment complex and pointed out the trailer park next door. The wealthy coworker remarked that it must be nice to live next to a storage facility, referring to the trailer park. He didn't believe us when we explained that people lived in those trailers. He thought that only happened on television shows. We all hoped that inner-city emergency medical services would bring him back down to earth, but it had no effect. Story 38. I used to teach at a very expensive private school that went from kindergarten through high school. Once I gave a ride to some 9-year-old students. A spoiled set of twins could not understand why my car looked old and poor. One said her father drives a Rolls-Royce and gets a new car every year, and asked why I did not buy a new one. When I explained I was in my first year of teaching and had only finished university the year before, she replied that their father had always had new cars, even at university. On another occasion, one of them smashed her brand new iPhone to show the other students her father would simply buy her a replacement. Story 39. At a high-end children's clothing resale store called Once Upon a Child, they buy Nike, Adidas, or other well-known brand-name children's clothes, and only children's clothes. Everything must be new or barely worn, or they will not buy it. Usually, when you bring in a bunch of items, they will purchase only about 10%. I once saw them refuse a beautiful custom-made dress that an Indian couple had spent $300 on for their only child because it was not a brand name. A mother was selling a pile of clothes and finding out what the store would accept and for how much. Her 8-year-old daughter wandered off into the store and came back with something she wanted to buy. Mother: "No, sweetie, we don't shop here. We only come here so poor people have nice things to buy." Story 40. My rich friend told me to take Friday off work and fly out to visit him that weekend. He said it was last minute, but there were seats available. I said I did not think I could make it. He replied that he had looked and only coach was available and that I should not be embarrassed. He did not blame me for not wanting to sit next to them. I thought, does he truly think that is why I earn an average income? Story 41. Why cannot you just get a new couch? It is almost time for summer furniture. Anyway. Story 42. If you're struggling financially, you could cancel your Disney Plus subscription. Story 43. When McDonald's published an employee budget, the $100 for car insurance or the $20 for medical expenses. Story 44. How poor can someone really be if they have a refrigerator in their home? Story 45. The rich kid, who is a super nice guy, wanted to go drinking with my buddy. My buddy said he did not have any money. The rich kid said no problem and that we would stop at an automated teller machine on the way there. The concept of having no money did not even register. The rich kid thought my buddy simply did not have any cash in his wallet. Story 46. I mean, it's one banana, Michael. How much could it cost? $10? Story 47. $350,000 a year is not enough to live. This was my cantankerous uncle-in-law 3 years ago, complaining that if he is not making close to $1 million a year, he cannot live because it will not cover the basics. He also lacked the self-awareness to realize he is the only person on his payroll making over $100,000 a year. If he cannot make it on $350,000 a year, what does he think his employees do? Story 48. Thinking we are still living on the $2,000 checks we received 4 years ago. Story 49. A really rich kid I worked with who was about 25 or 26 was at a work dinner with us. He ordered a bottle of wine from the sommelier. The sommelier said he no longer had that vintage but had a similar one and explained the price difference. The first bottle would have been $750 and the new bottle would be $825. The young man looked around the table and asked, "Is that a lot?" Our boss replied, "Not if you're buying. But if I am buying, you'd better pick something else." Story 50. The owner of the company I used to work for was a car guy. His daily driver was a giant, fully kit-out Chevy Tahoe that he rarely drove with more than himself in. He also owned a Ferrari, 1 or 2 Mercedes, and a Jaguar. I do not know the specific models. I just know they were pricey. One day, after I had worked there for a couple of years, he came to our office in Northern California and handed me the fob to his Tahoe. He said he needed me to drive it down to Paso Robles, our office on the Central Coast, about a 5-hour drive, where he is based. When I asked how I would get home, he said he would make sure I got taken care of. When I asked how he would get back, he said he was picking up his Ferrari from the shop. Later in the day, I asked him to show me where the windshield wiper controls were, since rain was expected during my drive. He said everything was automatic, and when I asked how that worked, he asked how old my car was. He was a very nice guy who gave generous bonuses every year, but he was pretty out of touch with the rest of us. Story 51. My friend runs a charity, and some wealthy people took him out to dinner to discuss his work. When it came time to donate, they were hesitant to give. The dinner bill was $1,500, and they paid with an American Express card as if it were no big deal. Story 52. Gwyneth Paltrow talks about how her lifestyle brand Goop caters to the common woman with items including a $595 hoodie, a $625 cardigan, a $720 V-neck top, and a $66 jade egg marketed for vaginal use. Story 53. My coworker argued with me when I told him $20,000 would be life-changing for me and my family because it would not be life-changing for him. I think he believes everyone has a rich father who gives them money. I work at this job literally to survive, and he works there because his father told him he needed to get a job to keep receiving his allowance. Story 54. Honestly, the most out-of-touch statements by wealthy people result from failing to acknowledge their wealth. Too many people see themselves as victims of those who are wealthier. Story 55. Me. How can you justify paying us an exact median wage when the cost of living in Denver is far from median? Vice President of Comcast. I was on food stamps once and now look at me. You just have to work hard. Me, I was told that about college, too. I am $70,000 in debt and make slightly above minimum wage. Vice President of Comcast. I think you just have a bad attitude. The old pull yourself up by the bootstraps argument. Story 56. The doctor told me to work with my personal trainer to figure out a routine that would not make my chronic autoimmune disorder worse. I asked if he was going to cover the cost of that trainer out of his own pocket because insurance certainly will not cover it, and I have never been able to hold a job because of my condition. The doctor was shocked that poor people exist and that one was in his office. Story 57. Our multimillionaire CEO made us say thank you for the napkins at our staff meeting because someone else in the company had bought pizza and management had provided them. Story 58. They claim that it was not the money that made them happy. Story 59. I was telling a cute girl I met at a friend's birthday about a book I was reading called The Zanzibar Chest. It was about a British journalist whose father was a minor colonial official. The journalist traveled extensively as part of his father's work and his own. I mentioned wanting to travel to less popular destinations. I had always wanted to go to Mongolia. My grandfather got lost in the desert there once, which is a wild family story. Her response was that I should just enjoy my life and go. I know many people who travel a lot, so the advice was not that outlandish, but I explained that I had family to care for, things I needed to save for, and little flexibility at work. It became a point of contention. She said I should just say, fuck it, and go because my family would understand. My grandfather had late-stage Alzheimer's disease, and we were caring for him at home. He hardly knew my name and could not understand things. Story 60. My ex and I were struggling financially when we first got married. I made enough to pay the bills, but there was nothing extra. She decided to enroll in school, and when she was filling out the free application for federal student aid for financial aid, she asked me what my adjusted gross income was for the previous year. I had always done my own taxes, but I had thrown the paperwork away when I was done, so I had no idea. A friend who was at our house came from a wealthy family that owned a hotel chain and had government contracts and other businesses. Without a second thought, he said to call my accountant because they would have it. He was baffled that not everyone had a personal accountant. It blew his mind. Story 61. When you have a baby, you'll have a night nurse and a day nanny. It's not that crazy. I'm not sure if she ever changed a diaper to this day. Story 62. Someone in my office, whom we all jokingly call a distilled, pure boomer, started talking about Hurricane Katrina and criticized people for not evacuating. I told him many people in New Orleans, Louisiana did not have the means to leave even if they wanted to. He replied that he knew times get tough, but sometimes you just have to crack open that savings account. I was dumbfounded that he assumed people in the Ninth Ward had a stash of money they were just sitting on. Story 63. When wealthy people say that using electronic benefits transfer is stealing from the government, I reply that I want to eat tonight, have a roof over my head, and I do not get paid enough to do so. Story 64. Why do you still have your wisdom teeth at the age of 31? Because my parents were poor. Story 65. If you are that stressed, try what I have been doing recently. I go on a Disney cruise every 2 months and sometimes more often. Story 66. This is from the United Kingdom's current Prime Minister, so we would realize that, as someone worth more than our king, he can resonate with those he represents who are struggling in poverty. An interviewer asked if he had ever gone without anything. All sorts of things, like many people. There were things I wanted as a child that I could not have. For example, Sky Television. That was something we never had growing up. Story 67. My sister's ex was born into a rich family and was so out of touch it was unreal. He was the poster child for a spoiled white man. Racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and downright rude. His parents found him a fancy job that paid very well, and he immediately threw it in my face that I'm lazy and stupid for not finding better work. I have a disability, and it's incredibly difficult to find employment. He told me, if you don't like the job market in this country, leave. Easy for a rich, spoiled brat to say when his parents' money can pay for your cruises around the world, while I'm struggling just to find my next meal. I'm glad my sister dumped him. Story 68. When I was growing up, we didn't have Sky Television. Fuck off, Sunak. The 4th of July can't come soon enough. Story 69. A friend from high school was genuinely confused why I needed a new job after I quit my last one. He said jobs in high school are just for fun because our parents pay for everything. I explained that my parents did not pay for my car, insurance, gas, or other expenses. Story 70. I did some medical volunteer work in Haiti after the earthquake. I stayed on a Christian missionary compound because the clinic I worked at was supported by the mission. At dinner, I was describing the clinic bathroom, which was basically an outhouse, and how instead of toilet paper, there was a bucket with torn-up book pages. The only reaction I got was a gasp followed by, "I cannot believe they treat books that way." I was speechless. If that is what you took away from the situation, I cannot help you. Story 71. I have never experienced this personally, but I have heard several stories about wealthy people who flat out refuse to respond to anything said or asked by cashiers, repair people, drivers, and so on, claiming they do not talk to the help. Story 72. I taught high school math at a private school for wealthy kids. The lesson was about compound interest and how it is calculated. A student raised their hand and asked, "Why should we know this?" Naive me answered that you need to know when you get a loan to buy a car or a mortgage for a house. They looked baffled and asked why I would not pay for it in cash, like the last Mercedes-Benz I bought. I could not reply. Story 73. My family only has a small yacht, as the follow-up to saying I am only sexist because I am poor. Honorable mentions. I should know which years the Indiana Jones movies came out because my father produced them. My father bought me an apartment in one of the most expensive cities in the world that sits empty so I have a place to stay when I visit. I am choosing which university to attend based on which one has the nicest piano for me to play. What did I do over break? I stayed in a villa on the French Riviera for 2 months. My millionaire boyfriend is paying my tuition. Story 74. The owner of my company in Texas couldn't believe that everyone in our department had never been on an Alaskan vacation. He had me draw up floor plans for his new house, including an entire room dedicated to Christmas decorations that stayed up year-round because his wife loved the holiday. The room even had a closet for the decorations. Story 75. I worked at a warehouse picking job. They did not like that we conversed as we passed each other. The owner made us gather and said we should be grateful we were not working in the sewers, as if that was all we could aspire to do outside of that job. Story 76. A guy I went to college with is actually a really good friend, but he has no idea how the real world works. His family bought him a decked-out house valued at more than $1 million and sold it to him on a personal, interest-free loan for $300,000. I called him on that when he said his family was not really that rich. He said it was just good timing. I do like him, but in that moment I wanted to strangle him. Story 77. My friend, who grew up without financial worries, once said that he does not really eat leftovers. I told him that was one of the most entitled things I had ever heard. I laughed. I would not even say he is rich, but it is definitely a different world when you never have to think about money. Story 78. Money is freedom, food, shelter, and health. Sometimes it keeps you out of legal trouble. Not enough money causes a lot of relationship stress. Story 79. Whenever people in my life tell friends to just buy a house, because paying rent is stupid when it could be a mortgage, I get their point. The people they say this to have not been able to save enough for a down payment. When told to buy a house, they respond with "why not?" or are confused by the idea of having to save for one in the first place. Someone once asked me why I have a mortgage and did not just pay cash outright because mortgages have interest, so if you just pay with cash you will not have any interest. I said, our loan was $170,000, but if we take the full 30 years to pay it off, we will have paid nearly as much on it as our home is worth after interest. Would you be willing to pay off our loan so we can pay you instead of the bank? First he said no, then he asked why. not the other way around. That says it all. Story 80. My ex did not know that you had to pay for electricity and was surprised when I told him that if you did not pay the bill, the service would be shut off. He was not wealthy. His parents paid all his bills. Story 81. Last year, at an elite university, I had already gotten used to outlandish things. Studying with the children of royalty, politicians, and CEOs of household brands. By contrast, my dad is a dosser, and I went through university in what can only be described as poverty. One day, while studying in the library with the child of wealthy landowners, she casually claimed how proud she was of us for funding ourselves through university. A little confused, I asked what she meant, since I work full-time and she lives off her trust fund. She clarified that she meant choosing to spend her trust fund on her law degree was the same as my choosing to work full-time to pay for mine, whereas everyone else had been pushed to attend by their parents. Story 82. When I was a nanny for a tech family, my boss was late in paying me and offered to pay me in Bitcoin instead. If you were short on cash, what makes you think I want your fake internet dollars that cannot pay my rent? Story 83. An older white woman who saw a young Hispanic employee leaving the bathroom asked if there was a restroom for customers only, not employees. We had not opened yet. Story 84. Anything said by Dave Ramsey. Just eat rice and beans and live in your car in a Walmart parking lot until you are rich. Story 85. My former boss was whining about having to buy new furniture from an upscale furniture store because his sister was coming to visit. Poor guy. Story 86. I pay $13,000 for private school. They need to figure out why my child has behavioral problems. Not me. Story 87. A man I worked with once could not comprehend that I have never been on an airplane. It was as if I had told an ordinary person that I had never been in a car. Story 88. Paris Hilton did not know that cut flowers die because hers were replaced every day. Story 89. My cousin married a wealthy man when she was 21 and she grew up well off. I was 22 and had just gotten married, and she asked why we would rent a crummy apartment when a house is so much better. I had to explain that not everyone can afford a home in their early 20s, and especially not a house valued at $3 million like the one she and her husband owned outright. She rolled her eyes and said that if we were both working we should be able to buy a home. We did buy a house the next year, a small starter home that cost $150,000. She said she did not understand why we did not build a new, never-used house. Story 90. Some people are just too sensitive to work, said the trust fund socialite. Story 91. In law school, we had a class about constitutional law. One topic was voter registration and identification, and how some measures like Jim Crow laws had racially motivated purposes. One case discussed the use of family Bibles as evidence of birth when people did not have a hospital-issued birth certificate. One student asked why anyone would not get a birth certificate at the hospital. When the teacher explained that this also applied to destitute people in remote rural areas in the 1950s, she did not understand. She also became very angry about the idea that stealing food to feed a starving family remains a crime and should be punished. She lost her mind when a Jewish classmate referred on her personal Facebook to Ash Wednesday as having some schmutz on her forehead. She tried to get the student removed from student government. I have never met someone so entitled, so out of touch, and yet so enraged. It was strange. I do not miss law school at all. Story 92. A man was watching television with his girlfriend. The show was about children in developing countries who were refilling their water bottles from a polluted river. His girlfriend asked why they were doing that instead of going home and filling their bottles with tap water. Story 93. I once visited a tent for very important people at the Oktoberfest in Munich. They handed out umbrellas and then sprayed champagne from 12-liter bottles, so the crowd used the umbrellas to protect themselves. Story 94. When I was told I was too old for a roommate at 26, I was surprised. I make a decent income, but living is expensive these days. Half of the people my age in my area are living with their parents out of necessity. Story 95. A self-made man who inherited his father's successful business. The government should not fund social services. Taxes should be lowered, and then people will have the money to donate to support them. Story 96. I was hired during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic to work a job that paid $11 an hour. When I asked about my pay, the owner said, "Just talk to your accountant about it." Story 97. My sister-in-law was dating a man who grew up in India but was studying in the United States. His father was a top surgeon, and he grew up in a house where each family member had their own private quarters. A few years ago, we went to the beach and were cleaning up after my mother-in-law had cooked dinner. I handed him a broom to sweep, and he proceeded to whack the floor with it. I asked if it was the first time he had swept. He smiled sheepishly and said he had seen the household staff do it that way, so he thought that was how it should be done. Later, we let him cut his birthday cake. He stared at it, admitted the household staff always did that part, and then he butchered the cake. I will never forget when he told me I needed to travel more and should not let anything hold me back. I stared at him and asked how much he thought a special education teacher earned. Unbelievable. Story 98. We were poor. Our house was only 3,000 square feet. Story 99. When I was in college, I met a student who told me that his father took him to buy a car for his birthday. He knew what he wanted but could not decide between two colors, so his father bought both cars. He was upset that his father told him he had to keep them clean. Story 100. Anyone can get a job in this area. The company's chief executive officer makes $500,000 a year, and I make $40,000 a year. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.